Before Asal-Uttar became a name associated with burning tanks and a broken armored thrust, the road to that battlefield began far from the sugarcane fields of Punjab. It began in the salt flats of the Run of Kutch, moved through the political and military pressure of Kashmir, and only then reached the roads that led toward Kemkaran and the Beas crossings. That matters because armored battles do not appear out of nowhere, as if tanks simply roll onto a map and decide history by themselves. The Battle of Asal-Uttar stands out in the history of post-war armored warfare because it showed how a fast, confident armored plan could be defeated by terrain, timing, preparation, and combined arms. But the crisis that made such a plan possible had already been building for months. If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore. The Run of Kutch was an unlikely place for the opening movement of a campaign that would eventually produce one of the most famous tank battles since the Second World War. It was a harsh frontier of salt marsh, scrub, seasonal water, and difficult tracks near the Arabian Sea, where navigation and supply could be as troublesome as enemy fire. In the dry season, certain routes became passable enough for military movement, but the country was still awkward, exposed, and unforgiving. It was not the classic tank country of open European plains, or the more familiar canal-lined farmland of Punjab. Yet it was exactly the kind of borderland where patrols, posts, and disputed claims could test an opponent's nerve without immediately seeming to threaten a nation's heartland. The clashes in the Run of Kutch during the first half of 1965 were limited compared with what followed, but they were not meaningless skirmishes. They involved regular forces, local outposts, artillery fire, and the gradual thickening of a frontier dispute into a military confrontation. Indian forces in the area were relatively thin, and some positions were held by police or paramilitary elements before the army presence expanded. Pakistan used the opportunity to apply pressure in a sector where it believed it could act with advantage and perhaps draw conclusions about Indian readiness. Tanks were not yet the central actors in the story, but mobility already mattered. Vehicles, guns, roads, and the ability to concentrate force quickly were beginning to shape the logic of the crisis. What made Kutch important was less the ground itself than the interpretation each side placed upon it. Pakistan's leadership saw signs that India might be cautious, slow to escalate, and still recovering from the shock of the 1962 war with China. India, for its part, saw a warning that limited pressure on a remote frontier could become a test of national resolve. In military history, this kind of interpretation is often as dangerous as the actual fighting. A successful local action can look like proof that an opponent will not respond strongly. A restrained response can be mistaken for weakness. Those assumptions would matter enormously when planners later imagined what armor might accomplish in Punjab. By mid-1965, the fighting in Kutch had been damped down through outside diplomatic pressure and a ceasefire, but the deeper contest had not been settled. The guns were quieter, yet the lesson drawn in different headquarters was not the same. For Pakistan, Kutch seemed to suggest that carefully chosen pressure might produce results without provoking a full-scale Indian counterstroke. For India, it exposed the need to meet force with force while avoiding panic or overreaction. This is one of the first lessons of the season. Armored warfare is never just about the machines waiting in motor pools. It is also about political assumptions, escalation control, and the belief that a commander can choose where a war begins and where it will stop. Kashmir was a different matter entirely. Unlike the Run of Kutch, it was not a marginal border dispute in a remote salt desert. It was the central unresolved issue between India and Pakistan, emotionally charged, strategically sensitive, and tied to the legitimacy claims of both states. Its terrain was also very different from the armored country that would later dominate the Kemkaran sector. Mountains, valleys, passes, and narrow roads made large tank operations difficult in much of Kashmir, but that did not make the region irrelevant to armor. Kashmir connected to Jammu, to the road toward Akhnur, and ultimately to the wider question of whether pressure in one sector could force a decision somewhere else. The move from Kutch to Kashmir was therefore a move from testing to escalation. Pakistan's leaders believed there was an opportunity to change the situation in Kashmir before India could fully respond. The assumption was that covert or semi-covert action might ignite local unrest, strain Indian control, and create a political military crisis without immediately requiring a full conventional war. That belief would soon take form in Operation Gibraltar, the infiltration campaign that pushed armed men across the ceasefire line in Kashmir. The details of that operation belong to the next stage of the story, but its roots lay in the confidence and risk-taking that had grown after Kutch. Limited success at the edge of the map encouraged a gamble at the center of the dispute.
That confidence was reinforced by Pakistan's sense of military modernization. By 1965, Pakistan possessed American-supplied equipment that appeared impressive, especially when compared with parts of India's mixed and uneven inventory. The Patton tank, which would later loom so large in the memory of Asal Uttar, symbolized modern armored power, mobile, heavily armed for its time, and psychologically intimidating. But equipment can deceive the people who trust it too much. A tank that looks formidable on parade or in training still depends on reconnaissance, infantry, artillery, engineers, maintenance crews, fuel columns, recovery vehicles, and clear command decisions. The danger for any army is to mistake possession of good machines for mastery of the conditions under which those machines must fight.
India's position in 1965 was complicated. The Indian Army was still absorbing lessons from the 1962 defeat against China, and reorganization was uneven across commands and formations. Some units were well led and determined, while others struggled with shortages, older equipment, or difficult deployments. Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri's government also had to judge how far to go in responding to pressure without letting Pakistan choose the tempo and location of every crisis. This mattered because India's eventual response would not be limited to simply blocking infiltrators in Kashmir. As pressure grew, Indian leaders and commanders began to think in terms of the whole Western Front. That wider view would eventually bring Punjab, and therefore armor, into the center of the war. When the infiltration in Kashmir began in August 1965, the plan depended on assumptions that proved fragile. Pakistan expected that armed infiltration could unsettle Indian control and perhaps trigger wider support among the local population. Instead, Indian forces and local authorities responded, and the fighting intensified along the ceasefire line. The conflict did not stay hidden, tidy, or easily deniable. Once troops were engaged in the hills and along the routes of Kashmir, each side faced pressure to regain initiative. India moved to secure key approaches and passes, while Pakistan had to consider how to prevent its plan from collapsing into a failed covert operation. The military problem was widening, and widening problems are especially dangerous in a region where roads and axes of advance determine everything. The pressure around Kashmir soon pointed toward the next escalation, a conventional offensive aimed at changing the balance by force. The area around Chamb and Akhnor, southwest of the Kashmir Valley, was especially important because it connected mountain fighting to more open approaches. A blow there could threaten Indian communications and create a crisis larger than the infiltration campaign itself. For Pakistan, this offered a way to recover momentum. For India, it raised the question of whether the war could be contained if Pakistan used regular formations to alter the situation in Jammu and Kashmir. The logic of the conflict was shifting from hidden movement to open battle. Once that happened, tanks in the plains were no longer background equipment. They were potential instruments of decision.
This is the point at which the story begins to move toward Punjab. Large armored forces need room, roads, fuel, and objectives worth the risk of committing them. The plains of Punjab offered what Kashmir largely did not: space for mechanized movement and the possibility of operational rupture. Pakistan's later plan in the Kemkaran sector would depend on the belief that a strong armored thrust could break through, seize key ground, and push toward the Bees line before India could fully stabilize the front. India's answer would be very different. It would rely not on meeting speed with speed alone, but on choosing ground, slowing movement, using mines and artillery, and turning a withdrawal into preparation. Those ideas had not yet fully taken shape, but the conditions that required them were already forming.
In the long history of armored warfare, this stage of the 1965 war shows how far tanks had come since their first use as trench-breaking machines. By the mid-20th century, tanks were part of a wider system of maneuver, communications, air power, logistics, and political decision-making. The comparison with earlier armored battles is useful because it reminds us that technology alone never solved the problem. At Cambrai in 1917, tanks shocked defenders but could not by themselves deliver lasting exploitation. In 1965, the same basic lesson returned in a new form. Armor could create danger, but only combined arms could turn danger into success. Kutch tested resolve, Kashmir widened the crisis, and Punjab would test whether armored ambition could survive contact with prepared defense. By the time the war moved toward the fields around Kemkaran, the essential assumptions had already been made. Pakistan believed that initiative, modern armor, and a bold thrust could produce a war-shaping result. India learned, under pressure, that survival might depend on absorbing the first blow, refusing to be fixed where the enemy wanted, and reshaping the battlefield before the decisive clash arrived. The journey from Kutch to Kashmir may seem distant from the wrecked tanks later gathered in the memory of Asal-Uttar, but it was the necessary beginning of the same story. Small posts, disputed borders, infiltrated routes, and widening political decisions all helped open the road to armored battle. The tanks did not cause the war by themselves. They became the chosen tools once escalation had created the space for them.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.